Good morning, Year 6, and welcome to your second English lesson. Today you are going to complete your read and response task in the class materials section of your Teams folder. These reading extracts are also available to look at online, but I am going to be reading them to you. So let's start with Carrie's War, Chapter 2. He threw up all over Miss Fazackerly's skirt. He had been feeling sick ever since they left the main junction and climbed into the joggling, jolting little train for the last lap of their journey, but the sudden whistle had finished him. Such a noise, it seemed to split the sky open. "Enough to frighten the dead," Miss Fazackerly said, mopping her skirt and Nick's face with the handkerchief. He lay back, limp as a rag, and let her do it, the way he always let people do things for him, not lifting a finger. "Poor lamb," Miss Fazackerly said, but Carrie looked stern. "I knew he'd be sick," she said smugly. "Might have warned me then, mightn't you?" Miss Fazackerly said. Not unkindly. She was one of the kindest teachers in school, but Carrie wanted to cry suddenly. Being Carrie, though, she stared crossly out of the carriage window and hid her sadness. The train was slowing. "Here we are," Miss Fazackerly said. "Collect your things, don't leave anything. Take care of Nick, Carrie." Carrie scowled. She loved Nick, loved him so much that sometimes it gave her a pain, but she hated to be told to do something that she was going to do anyway. Nevertheless, she moved to the luggage rack and pulled down their cases. These had once seemed quite light, but now it felt as if they had been weighed down with stones, and they got heavier and heavier as they left the station and struggled down a steep, gravelly path. Nick clung to Carrie's sleeve as they arrived at a building with several steps leading up to it. They were told to get into single file so that their names could be checked at the door. Carrie looked around, bewildered, and saw a boy she knew. "Albert," she whispered. "What's happening?" "A kind of cattle auction, it seems." Albert sounded calmly disgusted. Carrie too began to feel ill with fear that no one would choose her, the way that she always felt when they picked teams at school. Suppose she was left to last? She dragged Nick into the crowd of waiting children and stood, eyes on the ground, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Children left the line and were taken away. Only unwanted ones left, Carrie thought. Okay, so on this page, we have a chapter from Goodnight, Mr. Tom. Again, you can access these in the class materials folder in your Teams. "Yes," said Tom bluntly on opening the front door. "What do you want?" A harassed, middle-aged woman in a green coat and felt hat stood on his step. He glanced at the armband on her sleeve. She gave him an awkward smile. "I'm the billeting officer for this area," she began. "Oh yes, and what's that got to do with me?" She flushed slightly. "Well, Mr. Oakley. Thomas Oakley." "Ah, thank you, Mr. Oakley." She paused and took a deep breath. "Mr. Oakley, with the declaration of war imminent," Tom waved his hand. "I knows all that. Get to the point. What do you want?" He noticed a small boy at her side. "It's him I've come about," she said. "I'm on my way to your village hall with the others." "What others?" She stepped to one side, behind the large iron gate which stood at the end of the graveyard, where a group of children. Many of them were filthy and very poorly clad. Only a handful had a blazer or coat. They all looked bewildered and exhausted. One tiny, dark-haired girl in the front was hanging firmly onto a new teddy bear. The woman touched the boy at her side and pushed him forward. "There's no need to tell me," said Tom. "It's obligatory, and it's for the war effort." "You are entitled to choose your child, I know," began the woman apologetically. Tom gave a snort. "But," she continued, "his mother wants him to be with someone who's religious or near a church. She was quite adamant. Said she would only let him be evacuated if he was." "Was what?" asked Tom impatiently. "Near a church." Tom took a second look at the child. The boy was thin and sickly looking, pale with limp sandy hair and dull grey eyes. "His name's Willie," said the woman. Willie, who had been staring at the ground, looked up. Round his neck, hanging from a piece of string, was a cardboard label. It read William Beach. Tom was well into his 60s, a healthy, robust, stockily built man with a head of thick white hair. Although he was of average height, in Willie's eyes he was a towering giant with skin like coarse, wrinkled brown paper and a voice like thunder. He glared at Willie. "You'd best come in," he said abruptly. The woman gave a relieved smile. "Thank you so much," she said, and she backed quickly away and hurried down the tiny path towards the other children. Willie watched her go. Come on in, repeated Tom harshly. I ain't got all day. Nervously, Willie followed him into a dark hallway. It took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust from the brilliant sunshine he had left to the comparative darkness of the cottage. He could just make out the shapes of a few coats hanging on some wooden pegs and 2 pairs of boots standing below. Suppose you'd best know where to put your things, muttered Tom, looking up at the coat rack and then down at Willie. He scratched his head. But I fear I'd best put in a low peg. He opened a door on his left and walked into the front room, leaving Willie in the hallway still clutching onto his brown carrier bag. Through the half-open door he could see a large black cooking range with a fire in it and old threadbare armchair nearby. He shivered. Presently Tom came out with a pencil. You can put that old bag down, he said gruffly. You ain't going no place else. Willie did so, and Tom handed him the pencil. He stared blankly up at him. Go on, said Tom. I told you before I ain't got all day. Now make a mark so's I know where to put a peg, see? Willie made a faint dot on the wall beside the hem of one of the large coats. Make a nice big un so as can see it clear like. Willie drew a small circle and filled it in. Tom leaned down and peered at it. Neat little chap, ain't you? Give me your mackintosh and I'll put it on top of mine for now. With shaking fingers, Willie undid his belt and buttons, peeled off the mackintosh and held it in his arms. Tom took it from him and hung it on top of his great coat. He walked back into the front room. Come on, he said. Willie followed him in. It was a small, comfortable room with 2 windows. The front one looked out onto the graveyard, the other to a little garden at the side. The large black range stood solidly in an alcove in the back wall, a thick, dark pipe curving its way upward through the ceiling. Stretched out beneath the side window were a few shelves filled with books, old newspapers, and odds and ends, and by the front window stood a heavy wooden table and 2 chairs. The flagstone floor was covered in a faded crimson green and brown rug. Willie glanced at the armchair by the range and the objects that lay on top of the small wooden table beside it, a pipe, a book, and a baccy jar. Pull that stool up by the fire and I'll give you something to eat. Willie made no movement. Go on, sit down, boy, he repeated. You got wax in your ears. Willie pulled a small wooden stool from a corner and sat down in front of the fire. He felt frightened and lonely. Tom cooked 2 rashers of bacon and placed a slab of bread with the fresh bacon dripping beside it onto a plate. He put it on the table with a mug of hot tea. Willie watched him silently, his bony elbows and knees jutting out angularly beneath his thin grey jersey and shorts. He tugged nervously at the top of his woolen socks, and a faint smell of warm rubber drifted upwards from his white plimsolls. Eat that up, said Tom. Willie dragged himself reluctantly from the warmth of the fire and sat at the table. You can put your own sugar in, Tom grunted. Willie politely took a spoonful, dunked it into the large white mug of tea and stirred it. He bit into the bread, but a large lump in his throat made swallowing difficult. He didn't feel at all hungry, but remembered apprehensively what his mum had said about doing as he was told. He stared out at the graveyard. The sun shone brilliantly, yet he felt cold. He gazed at the few trees around the graves. Their leaves were all different colours, pale greens, amber, yellow. Ain't you hungry? Asked Tom from his armchair. Willie looked up, startled. Yes, mister, he whispered. Just a slow chewer then? That it? He nodded timidly and stared miserably at the plate. Bacon was a luxury. Only lodgers or visitors had bacon, and here he was not eating it. Maybe you can chew it more easy later, Tom beckoned him over to the stool. Put another spoon of that sugar in, boy, and bring that tea over here. Willie did so and returned to the stool. He held the warm mug tightly in his icy hands and shivered. Tom leaned towards him. What you got in your bag, then? I dunno, mumbled Willie. Mum packed it. She said I weren't to look in it. One of his socks slid halfway down his leg, revealing a large multicoloured bruise on his shin and a swollen red sore beside. That's a nasty old thing, Tom said, pointing to it. What give you that? Willie paled and pulled the sock up quickly. Best drink that before it gets cold, said Tom, sensing that the subject needed to be changed. Willie looked intently at the changing shapes of the flames and the fire and slowly drank the tea. It thundered in his throat in his attempt to swallow it quietly. Tom left the room briefly and within a few minutes returned. I gotta go out for a spell. Then I'll fix your room, see? Up there, and he pointed to the ceiling. You ain't afraid of heights, are you? Willie shook his head. That's good, or you'd have had to sleep under the table. He bent over the range and shovelled some fresh coke into the fire. "Here's an old scarf of mine," he muttered, and he threw a khaki object over Willie's knees. He noticed another bruise on the boy's thigh, but said nothing. "Have a wander round the graveyard. Don't be scared of the dead. Least they can't drop an old bomb on your head." "No, mister," agreed Willie politely. "And close the front door behind you, else Sammy'll be eating your bacon." "Yes, mister." Willie heard him slam the front door and listened to the sound of his footsteps gradually fading. He hugged himself tightly and rocked backwards and forwards on the stool. "I must be good," he whispered urgently. "I must be good," and he rubbed a sore spot on his arm. He was such a bad boy. He knew that. Mum said she was kinder to him than most mothers. She only gave him soft beatings. He shuddered. He was dreading the moment when Mr. Oakley would discover how wicked he was. He was stronger looking than Mum. The flames in the range flickered and danced before his eyes, cracking in sudden bursts, though not in a venomous way. He felt that it was a friendly crackle. He turned to look for something that was missing. He stood up and moved towards the shelves under the side window. There, he was being bad again, putting his nose in where it didn't belong. He looked up quickly to make sure Mr. Oakley wasn't spying at him through the window. Mum said war was a punishment from God for people's sins, so he'd better watch out. She didn't tell him what to watch out for, though. It could be in this room, he thought, or maybe the graveyard. He knelt on one of the chairs at the front window and peered out. Graves didn't look so scary as she had made out, even though he knew that he was surrounded by dead bodies. But what was it that was missing? A bird chirruped in the garden. Of course, that was it. He could hear traffic and banging and shouting. He couldn't hear traffic and banging and shouting. He looked around at the room again. His eyes rested on the stool where the woolen scarf lay. He'd go outside. He picked it up and, wrapping it round his neck, he went into the hall and closed the front door carefully behind him. Between him and the graveyard lay a small flat garden. Along the edge of it were little clusters of flowers. Willie stepped forward to the edge where the garden ended and the graveyard began. He plunged his hands deep into his pockets and stood still for a moment.